My husband suggested something so wild I never imagined, but that night changed everything. He wanted me to be intimate with 3 men, and to my surprise I couldn't resist the idea. You won't believe what happens next as the night unfolds in ways none of us saw coming. I still remember the evening when everything changed. It was a sultry summer night, and I had just come home from work, exhausted from the day's demands. My husband Aidan was already sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes locked on me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. There was something different about his demeanor that night, something that made the air feel thick with anticipation. As I sat down next to him, I could feel his eyes on me, studying my every move. "How was work?" he asked, his voice unusually soft, almost seductive. I shrugged, letting out a tired sigh, the usual, just long and tired ing. But Odin wasn't paying attention to my words. Instead, he placed his hand gently on my thigh. I was used to his affection, but tonight there was a different energy between us. His fingers trailed up my leg, and I turned to look at him, feeling my heart race. His eyes held a hunger, a desire that felt new and exciting. "I've been thinking," he began, leaning in closer, his voice barely a whisper, "about us, about what we need." His words sent a tremor through me, and I shifted in my seat, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Odin smiled, his hand moving higher, his breath warm against my ear. "I think we need something different, something to spice things up between us." I swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "Spice things up," I repeated, unsure of what he meant. He nodded, his lips brushing against my neck. "I want to see you with other men," he whispered, his words sending shock waves through my body. For a moment I was speechless, my mind reeling from what he had just said. I pulled back, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or regret, but all I found was desire, raw and unfiltered. "You want to see me with other men?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Odin nodded, his eyes dark with lust. "Yes, but not just any men. I want you to be with 3 strong, handsome black men. I want to see you lose yourself in their arms, feel their touch, and experience something new, something wild." My mind racing with a million thoughts. I had never imagined something like this, never considered that Aidan would even entertain the idea of sharing me with other men. But as I looked into his eyes, I could see the excitement there, the thrill of the forbidden, and strangely a part of me felt intrigued by the idea, curious about what it would feel like to be desired by men other than my husband, to be touched by their hands, kissed by their lips. I shifted uncomfortably, my body betraying me as a wave of heat washed over me. I don't know, Adon," I stammered, unsure of how to respond. Aidan reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I know it sounds crazy, but I promise you it'll be incredible. You'll love it, and I'll be right there watching you, admiring you. There's nothing to be afraid of." His words washed over me, and I found myself considering the possibility. Could I really do this? Could I really be with 3 other men while my husband watched? The idea felt so taboo, so wrong, but at the same time it ignited a spark deep inside me, one that I hadn't felt in a long time. I looked into Odin's eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation, but all I found was unwavering confidence. He wanted this, he wanted me to do this, and the thought of pleasing him, of giving him what he wanted, sent a rush of adrenaline through me. "Okay," I whispered, barely recognizing My own voice, I'll do it. Odin's eyes lit up with excitement and he leaned into kiss me, his lips soft and warm against mine. You won't regret this, he promised. His voice filled with anticipation. The days leading up to the night Odin had planned were filled with a strange mix of excitement and nerves. Every time I thought about what was coming, my stomach fluttered with a mixture of anxiety and desire. I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to focus on my usual routine, but the anticipation was always there, lingering in the back of my mind, teasing me with the possibilities of what was to come. And then finally the night arrived. Odin had arranged everything. The men he had chosen were already at the hotel when we arrived, waiting for us. As we walked into the room, my palms sweaty with nerves, but as soon as I saw them, all three of them, standing there with confident smiles on their faces, something inside me shifted. They were tall, muscular, their dark skin gleaming in the soft light of the room. Each one of them exuded power and strength, and I could feel their eyes on me, undressing me with their gazes. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely empowered. Odin stood beside me, his hand on the small of my back, guiding me forward. Don't be shy, he whispered in my ear, his voice laced with excitement. This is for you. I want you to enjoy it. I glanced up at him, my heart racing, and saw the hunger in his eyes. He wanted this. He wanted to see me with these men. And as nervous as I was, I couldn't deny that a part of me wanted it too. Slowly I took a step forward, my body trembling with anticipation. The men watched me, their eyes dark with desire, and as I moved closer to them, I could feel the tension in the room thickening. I was standing at the edge of something new, something exhilarating, and I was ready to dive in. The first man reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, sending a jolt of electricity through my body. His touch was firm yet gentle, and I found myself leaning into him, my breath hitching as his fingers trailed up my arm. His eyes met mine, and I could see the desire there, the raw, unfiltered need that matched my own. Before I knew it, his lips were on mine, soft and warm, his kiss gentle at first but growing more insistent as he pulled me closer. My heart raced as I melted into him, his strong arms wrapping around me, holding me tight. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, his muscles flexing beneath my hands as I ran them over his chest. Behind me I could feel Odin watching, his eyes burning into my skin. I glanced over my shoulder, catching his gaze, and the look on his face sent a rush of excitement through me. He wanted this. He wanted to see me like this, wanted to watch me lose myself in the arms of another man. The second man stepped forward, his hand sliding around my waist as he pressed his body against mine from behind. I could feel the heat of his breath on my neck, his lips brushing against my skin as he kissed me softly. My body trembled with desire, my mind spinning with the intensity of it all. I had never felt anything like this before, this overwhelming sensation of being desired, of being wanted by not just one man but three. It was intoxicating, and I could feel myself getting lost in it, my body responding to their every touch, every kiss. Odin's voice broke through the haze of desire that had clouded my mind. You're beautiful, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I love seeing you like this. His words sent a surge of confidence through me, and I turned my attention back to the men in front of me. Their touches became more insistent as the three men drew closer, their bodies surrounding me, and I could feel the heat radiating off them, engulfing me in a warmth I hadn't realized I craved. My breath quickening as their hands explored my body, each touch sending a new ripple of sensation through me. There was a strange sense of empowerment, knowing I was the center of their attention, the object of their desire. The man in front of me pressed his hand to the small of my back, pulling me closer until our bodies were flush against each other. I could feel every inch of him hard and ready, his breath coming out in hot, ragged bursts against my cheek as he leaned in to kiss me. Again, this time the kiss wasn't gentle. It was fierce, hungry, like he was starving for me. His tongue parted my lips, deepening the kiss, and I could feel the need in his touch and the way his hands gripped my hips as if he couldn't get enough. Behind me, the second man's hand slid up my sides, his fingers tracing the curve of my waist before moving higher, cupping my breasts through the thin fabric of my dress. His touch was firm, commanding, and I gasped as his thumbs brushed over my nipples, sending a jolt of pleasure straight to my core. I could feel the tension building inside me, a tight coil of desire that was winding tighter with every second. Odin was still there, watching everything unfold, his presence grounding me even as I felt myself slipping into the intoxicating pull of the moment. His eyes were locked on mine, and I could see the raw hunger in his gaze, the way he was enjoying this just as much as I was. He wasn't just watching, he was part of this intense, electrifying connection that was building between me and these men. "You're so beautiful," the third man whispered, his voice low and smooth as he stepped closer, his fingers trailing down my arm in a slow, deliberate caress. "I've been waiting to touch you, to feel how soft your skin is." I shivered at his words, my body responding instinctively to his touch, and I leaned back into him as his arms wrapped around my waist from behind. The way they touched me, the way they handled me, it was as though they had claimed me completely, and I found myself sinking into the sensation, surrendering to the overwhelming intensity of it all. Every inch of my skin was alive, tingling with pleasure as their hands roamed freely over my body. The man behind me gently nipped at my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin as his hands moved lower, sliding over my hips before coming to rest on my thighs. I gasped as his fingers slipped beneath the hem of my dress, teasing the bare skin of my legs, and I could feel the heat pooling between my thighs, the ache of desire becoming almost unbearable. "Do you like this?" he murmured against my skin, his voice dark and seductive. "Tell us how it feels." I love it," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my desire. "I've never felt anything like this before, and it was true. This was unlike anything I had ever experienced. There was an intensity to it, a rawness that I hadn't known I was missing. The way they touched me, the way they made me feel, it was like they were unlocking something deep inside me, something primal and fierce. The man in front of me smiled, his hand sliding up my back to tangle in my hair as he pulled me in for another kiss. This time it was slower, more deliberate, his lips moving against mine with a teasing gentleness that contrasted sharply with the hunger I felt inside. His free hand cued my face, his thumb stroking my cheek as he deepened the kiss, and I moaned softly into his mouth, lost in the sensation behind me. The man's fingers were still teasing the skin of my thighs, inching closer to where I wanted him most, but never quite giving me what I needed. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I felt him teasing me, drawing out the moment building the tea until it was almost unbearable. Please, I whispered. My voice barely audible but filled with need. Please don't. Stop. The man chuckled softly against my neck, his breath warm against my skin as he pressed a soft kiss to my shoulder. We're not going to stop, he promised, his voice a low growl. We're just getting started. I felt the knot of desire tighten in my core, growing more and more intense with every passing second. My body was trembling now, caught between the overwhelming need for release and the delicious anticipation of what was to come. The man in front of me kissed me one last time before pulling back slightly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. As he smiled, "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice filled with admiration. I can't wait to see how you feel. With a quick, fluid motion he slipped the straps of my dress off my shoulders, letting the fabric fall to the floor in a soft heap. Around my feet I was left standing in nothing but my underwear, exposed and vulnerable. But instead of feeling shy or embarrassed, I felt powerful. The way they looked at me, the way their eyes roamed over my body with unfiltered desire, it made me feel alive. Like I was the most beautiful woman in the world. I could feel Aiden's eyes on me too, his gaze filled with pride and lust as he watched me surrender to the moment. His approval, his encouragement, it fueled my desire, made me want this even more. The second man stepped closer now, his hands on my waist as he guided me toward the bed. "Lie down," he whispered, his voice gentle but commanding. "We're going to make you feel so good." I obeyed, my heart racing with anticipation as I lay back on the soft sheets, my body trembling with desire. The three men surrounded me, their hands and lips everywhere, touching, kissing, teasing. It was sensory overload, their combined touches making my head spin, my body ache with need. One of them kissed me deeply, his hand tangled in my hair as he pressed his body against mine, his muscles hard and warm beneath my hands. Another man kissed my neck, his lips trailing down to my chest, while the third ran his hands over my legs, his fingers dancing over my skin in a slow, torturous caress. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything but the pleasure they were giving me, the way my body was responding to their every touch. I was lost in it, completely consumed by the sensations coursing through me, and I never wanted it to end. Odin's voice broke through the haze of pleasure, his words soft but filled with emotion. "You're incredible," he whispered. "I love seeing you like this." His approval, his desire, it only made everything more intense, more thrilling. I wanted to please him, wanted to give him what he wanted, and knowing he was watching me, enjoying every moment, made the pleasure even more overwhelming. The man at my side leaned down to kiss me again, his lips soft and warm against mine as his hand slid down my body. "You're so beautiful," he murmured between kisses, his voice thick with desire. "I want to make you feel even better." And just when I thought I couldn't take any more, just when I thought the pleasure had reached its peak, they pushed me over the edge, sending me spiraling into a world of bliss so intense I couldn't even form words. My body trembled, my breath came out in ragged gasps, and I felt myself let go, completely surrendering to the moment, to the pleasure, to the intense, overwhelming sensation of being completely and utterly desired. It was more than I ever expected, more than I could have imagined. As the intensity of the moment began to fade, I lay there breathless and utterly spent, surrounded by the warmth of the three men who had taken me to places I had never imagined. Their touches softened becoming gentle caresses as we all began to come down from the high of the experience. My mind was still reeling, but I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. A deep fulfillment that lingered in the quiet aftermath. It wasn't just the physical pleasure, it was the emotional connection. The feeling of being desired so completely and knowing that Aiden had wanted this for me just as much as I had. I glanced over at him, and the look of pride and love in his eyes was everything I needed to see. Odin moved closer to me, his hand brushing the side of my face tenderly as he leaned down to kiss me softly. "You were amazing," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. I knew this would be unforgettable, but you were more than I ever dreamed. His words filled me with a deep sense of love and gratitude, and as I lay there surrounded by these men and the men I loved, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about satisfying some fantasy, it was about trust, about giving myself over completely, knowing that I was cherished and adored. We had stepped into something new together, and it had only brought us closer. The heat in the sauna was thick, the air humid and dense, creating a soft mist that clung to the wooden walls inside. The gentle hiss of water hitting the hot stones added a rhythmic backdrop to the otherwise quiet room. In one corner, a woman sat with her back against the warm wooden slats, her eyes closed in relaxation. She was in her early 40s, her skin glistening slightly with sweat. Her stepson had joined her earlier, sitting across from her, both of them wrapped in towels. He had been silent most of the time, feeling the tension in the room. It wasn't the first time they'd been alone together, but something about the intimate, enclosed space of the SAA made the air feel different, more charged. His eyes flickered to her now and then, catching the way her chest rose and fell with her deep breaths, the beads of sweat tracing along her collarbone and down her neck. "You okay over there?" Her voice broke the silence, soft but with a hint of playfulness. She opened her eyes and caught him staring, a smile playing at her lips. "Yeah, just hot in here," he replied, shifting a bit uncomfortably. She chuckled, leaning forward slightly, the movement causing her towel to slip just enough to expose more of her shoulder. "That's the point of a SAA," she teased. His eyes followed the movement, his heart thumping a little harder in his chest. He quickly averted his gaze, trying to focus on anything but the proximity of their bodies, the way the heat seemed to intensify, not just from the steam but from the unspoken tension between them. "You seem quiet today," she continued, her tone gentle, almost coaxing. "Something on your mind?" He hesitated, not sure how to answer without revealing too much. "Just thinking about stuff," he said vaguely, running a hand through his damp hair. She leaned back again, this time resting her head against the wall and closing her eyes once more. "You can talk to me. You know about anything. We've always been able to talk, haven't we?" He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, we have." There was a long pause, the sound of the steam hissing quietly filling the space between them. He was about to speak, maybe change the subject, when she shifted again, her towel slipping slightly lower, exposing the curve of her shoulder completely. "Now maybe it's just the heat," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper now, "but it feels different in here, doesn't it?" His breath caught in his throat. "Yeah, it does." She opened her eyes meeting his gaze directly. For the first time there was something in her look, something that hadn't been there before. She smiled, slow and deliberate, like she knew exactly what he was thinking. "Come sit next to me," she said, patting the space on the bench beside He hesitated for a moment but then stood and crossed the short distance between them, sitting down close enough that their legs almost touched. The heat from her skin combined with the steamy air made his pulse quicken for a few moments. Neither of them spoke. She tilted her head back, exposing more of her neck, and let out a soft sigh. "You know, I think about how much you've grown up," she murmured, her voice low and almost intimate. "You're not that kid anymore." His throat felt dry, but it wasn't from the heat. "You've always been there for me," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on her, trying to decipher what was happening. "And I always will be," she replied, her voice soft but carrying weight. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a palpable charge in the air, something unspoken but very much felt by both of them. "I should probably go," he said suddenly, but didn't move. It felt like the right thing to say, but everything in him was screaming to stay. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes lingering on his face before trailing down slightly. "Or you could stay," she whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. His breath hitched. He didn't know what to say, or maybe he did, but the words were caught in his throat. The closeness between them, the heat, the soft glow of the sounder light, everything seemed to blur together. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his hand. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice carrying a mix of reassurance and something else. Something deeper, something more. He swallowed hard, the touch of her hand sending a jolt of electricity through him. "This feels different," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whisper it does," she agreed, her hand lingering on his, her thumb gently brushing his skin. "But maybe different isn't bad." He turned to look at her, their faces inches apart now, the heat, the tension, the closeness, it was all too much. Without thinking, he leaned in just enough that their foreheads touched. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the moment, her breath warm against his lips. The steam hissed again, filling the side with its constant whisper, but neither of them paid any attention. The only thing that mattered was the space between them, the space that was rapidly closing. Her hand slid up his arm, slow and deliberate, until it rested on the back of his neck. He shuddered under her touch, his body reacting to the closeness, the intimacy of the moment. "This feels," he began, but the words failed him. "I know," she whispered, her lips brushing against his in the faintest, softest kiss. "I know." It was a moment suspended in time, the heat of the sound a blending with the heat between them. Doty moment between them, stretched, charged with unspoken tension. Her lips had barely brushed his, and yet the weight of that contact sent shock waves through him. It wasn't just the kiss, it was the knowledge of what it meant, the line they were tiptoeing closer to crossing. He froze for a second, unsure of whether to pull back or dive in, but his body seemed to make the choice for him. She pulled away first, but only by a breath. Her eyes searched his wide and questioning, as though she were silently asking for permission to continue. He swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "We shouldn't be doing this," he managed to say, his voice low and husky. Yet even as the words left his lips, his body betrayed him. He hadn't moved away. In fact, he leaned in just a fraction more, his gaze flickering down to her lips once again. "I know," she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the quiet hiss of the sauna, "but it feels like..." She trailed off, not quite able to find the right words. Her hand remained on the back of his neck, her fingers playing with the damp strands of his hair. Without another word, she leaned in once more, this time pressing her lips against his with a little more intent. It Wasn't a hurried kiss, but it carried weight, as if all the unspoken feelings between them had been building to this point. He responded instinctively, his hand finding her waist, pulling her close, the warmth of her skin against his, setting his nerves on fire. The kiss deepened slowly, their breaths mingling in the humid air. Her body pressed against his, and the towel that had barely clung to her began to loosen even further, slipping dangerously low. He felt her body move beneath his touch, the heat of her skin combining with the steam to create a heady mix of sensations. As his hands explored her waist, she tilted her head, allowing him to kiss along the curve of her neck, each touch sending shivers down her spine. She let out a quiet sigh, her fingers gripping his shoulders as he trailed his lips lower, the tension between them building with every second. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with desire but tinged with hesitation. Despite the intensity of the moment, part of him still couldn't believe they were here doing this. She pulled back slightly, looking him in the eye. "I've never been more sure of anything," she whispered, and before he could question it any further, she leaned in for another kiss, this one hungrier than the last. His hands moved down her back, finding the knot of her towel. Without thinking, he tugged gently, and the fabric slipped away, exposing her fully to him. She gasped softly but made no move to stop him. Instead, she let the towel fall away completely, leaving her vulnerable, and yet the look in her eyes told him she had never felt more in control. He could hardly breathe, his heart racing as his hands explored her bare skin. She pressed herself closer, her body responding to his touch as they continued to kiss, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they had all the time in the world. The heat of the S seemed to intensify the sensations, every touch feeling magnified. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion as his hands roamed her body, feeling the curve of her waist and the softness of her skin. She smiled at him, her lips curving up in a way that made his heart race even faster. "You always say the right thing," she teased lightly, though there was a seriousness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment they simply held each other, their foreheads resting together, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The sounder was quiet except for the gentle sound of the steam and the thumping of their hearts. She shifted, then her leg brushing against his as she adjusted her position, causing a jolt of sensation to shoot through him. He responded by pulling her even closer, their bodies flush against each other now, and her towel, which had been hanging on by a thread, slipped further down, leaving her entirely exposed in the humid heat. She didn't seem to mind. If anything, the vulnerability seemed to embolden her. She leaned back against the warm wooden wall, pulling him with her. Her hands found the knot of his towel, and with one quick tug it unraveled. Falling away, he gasped, his heart pounding as he felt the sensation of her body against his, unimpeded by fabric. The heat of the SAA combined with the heat of her skin was overwhelming. It felt as though the walls were closing in the air, thick and heady with the scent of sweat and desire. For a moment they just stood there, pressed against each other, breathing heavily. The intensity of the moment was dizzying. Neither of them could speak, their eyes locked as they tried to process what was happening. But then her hands were on him again, exploring his chest, his arms, her touch light and teasing. He groaned softly, his hands trailing down her back, tracing the curve of her spine. It felt as though he was losing control, the desire that had been simmering between them for so long finally bubbling over. She leaned in Pressing her lips to his neck, her breath hot against his skin, he shuddered, his fingers digging into her hips as he pulled her even closer, their bodies pressed together as though they were one. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice low and breathless. "Is this okay?" he nodded, unable to speak, his eyes wide as he looked at her. She smiled softly, leaning in for another kiss, this one deeper, more urgent. They sank down onto the bench, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that felt instinctual, primal. The heat of the SAA made everything feel more intense, their skin slick with sweat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they explored each other's bodies. Time seemed to blur as they continued, each touch, each kiss drawing them closer together. The steam in the SAA had long since dissipated, but the heat between them only grew stronger. It was as though the world outside the small wooden room ceased to exist, leaving just the two of them, lost in the moment. After what felt like hours, they finally slowed, their bodies exhausted but satisfied. She rested her head on his chest, their legs tangled together as they lay on the bench, the afterglow of their shared experience washing over them. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as they lay there, the silence of the sounder now comforting, almost peaceful. "That was," he began but couldn't find the words. She smiled up at him, her eyes soft and content. "Yes," she murmured, her voice drowsy with satisfaction. It was. They lay there for a long time, neither of them speaking, just enjoying the warmth of each other's presence. The tension that had hung over them for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding, a bond that went beyond words. Finally she shifted, sitting up and reaching for her towel. "We should probably get out of here before we pass out from the heat," she said with a light laugh. He smiled, nodding as he reached for his own towel. "Yeah, you're right." They dressed in silence, the intimacy of the moment lingering in the air between them. But there was no awkwardness, no regret. Just a quiet understanding that something between them had changed as they stepped out of the SAA and into the cool air of the house. He glanced at her, unsure of what to say, unsure of what came next, but she smiled at him, her eyes soft and warm. "We'll figure it out," she said simply, as though reading his thoughts, and somehow he knew they would. In the soft glow of the theater lights, Ethan sat next to Cla, his stepmom, their shoulders almost brushing against each other. The faint aroma of buttered popcorn filled the air, blending with the sound of laughter and chatter around them. It was a typical Friday night, but tonight felt different, charged with an energy that neither of them could ignore. "Are you ready for this?" Claire asked, glancing at him with a playful smile. She wore a casual sundress that hugged her curves perfectly, making Ethan's heart R. He admired the way her hair fell over her shoulders and how her laughter lit up her face. "Definitely," he replied, trying to sound casual, though he felt a flutter in his stomach as the film began. The two were engrossed in the story, but Ethan found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept wandering to Cla, the way she laughed at the jokes, her sparkling eyes, and the gentle way she touched his arm when she found something funny. It was all too much, and he could feel a tension building between them. The movie was a romantic comedy filled with moments that resonated with Ethan's own feelings. He glanced at Cla during a particularly tender scene where the characters shared a soft kiss. The theater was dimly lit, and for a brief moment Ethan saw her looking at him, her expression softening. It was as if the world around them faded, leaving just the two of them suspended in time. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, intertwining their Fingers. CLA looked down surprised but then she smiled, squeezing his hand gently. That simple gesture sent a jolt of electricity through him, and he could see a mixture of excitement and nervousness in her eyes. Ethan, she whispered, leaning closer. We shouldn't. I know, he interrupted softly, his gaze locked onto hers. But it feels so right. She bit her lip, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. But before she could respond, another romantic scene unfolded on the screen, and they both found themselves leaning in closer. The kiss that followed on screen was sweet and innocent, yet it sparked something primal within Ethan. He wanted to kiss. CLA needed to feel her lips against his, as if she could read his mind. CLA turned to him, her breath hitching in her throat. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment the world around them disappeared. Yes, she breathed, leaning closer. Their lips met softly, at first a gentle exploration of emotions that had been bottled up for too long. The kiss was electric, sending waves of warmth through Ethan's body. He had dreamed of this moment, and now that it was happening, it felt surreal. As they kissed, Ethan's hand slid to the back of CLA's neck, deepening the connection. She responded eagerly, tilting her head and parting her lips slightly, inviting him in. The kiss grew more passionate, filled with unspoken desires and longing. Every brush of their lips sent shivers down his spine. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Ethan could hardly believe what had just happened. CLA's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes sparkled with excitement and something more. Wow, she said, her voice shaky. That was unexpected. Yeah, but it felt amazing, he replied, his heart racing. I've wanted to do that for so long. Claire looked away, a mixture of joy and fear in her expression. We need to be careful, Ethan. This is complicated, I know, he said, glancing at the screen where the film continued to play. But his mind was on her, on them. But I don't want to stop. As the movie continued, they stole furtive glances at each other, the air between them thick with tension and possibility. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of what could happen next. He could feel the heat radiating from CLA, and he longed to explore that heat further. The next romantic scene played out on the screen, and Ethan felt a surge of boldness. He leaned in, capturing CLA's lips once more. This kiss was more urgent, filled with pent-up emotions and desires. Claire responded with equal fervor, her hands finding their way to his hair as she pulled him closer. Ethan, she murmured against his lips, her breath warm and inviting. What are we doing? I don't know, but I don't care, he replied, kissing her again, losing himself in the moment. Their kisses deepened, and Ethan could feel the world around them slipping away. The thrill of being in public, hidden in plain sight, added to the excitement. CLA's fingers trailed down his arm, sending shivers through him, igniting a fire that burned hotter with each touch. Suddenly the theater lights flickered, and a wave of reality hit them both. They pulled away, hearts racing and cheeks flushed. The film was nearing its end, and they both knew they had to compose themselves before the audience spilled into the aisles. Leighton, take a breather, CLA suggested, her voice still shaky but filled with excitement. I'll grab us some drinks. Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and nerves. Okay, I'll wait here. As Claire walked away, he took a moment to collect his thoughts. This was all so new and thrilling, but the reality of their situation weighed heavily on him. The connection they shared was undeniable, but the path ahead would be anything but easy. When CLA returned with 2 sodas, her smile was bright, and Ethan Felt rush of warmth at the sight of her. "Here you go," she said, handing him a cup. "Thanks," he replied, taking a sip. The cold liquid a stark contrast to the heat. Simmering between them, they shared a comfortable silence, their fingers brushing against each other as they leaned in close. "Do you think we should talk about what happened?" Claire asked her, eyes searching his. "Yeah," Ethan said, setting down his drink. "I think we should." Cla hesitated, her gaze drifting away. "I don't want to complicate things between us. I care about you, but he prompted, sensing her uncertainty. "But we're family now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels wrong, does it?" Ethan challenged, leaning in closer. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me, it feels right." Cla's eyes locked onto his, and he could see the conflict raging inside her. "I've thought about this a lot, Ethan, ever since we started getting closer. I couldn't help but wonder what," he urged, his heart pounding. "Tell me." "I wondered what it would be like to kiss you," she confessed, her cheeks flushed. "But I kept pushing those thoughts away. I didn't want to think about it either," Ethan admitted, "but I couldn't help myself. It's been building up for so long." Cla sighed, her expression softening. "Maybe we should take things slow, figure it out together." "I can do that," he replied, a smile spreading across his face. "But I want to explore this connection we have." Cla nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want that too, Ethan, just lean. Be careful." As they finished their drinks, the credits rolled on the screen and the theater began to empty. They shared glances filled with promise and excitement, the weight of their newfound connection hanging in the air. Once outside, the cool night breeze wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the warmth they had shared in the theater. Cla took a deep breath, her expression thoughtful. "What do we do now?" she asked, glancing up at the stars. "Can we hang out more? Maybe go for ice cream or something?" Ethan suggested, his heart racing with hope. Cla smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "I'd like that." They walked side by side, the conversation flowing easily between them. The initial tension had shifted to something more comfortable, yet the underlying current of attractions still simmered beneath the surface. When they reached the ice cream shop, they ordered their favorites, the sweet treats, a delightful distraction from the intensity of their earlier moments. As they sat at a small table outside, Ethan watched Cla, mesmerized by the way her eyes sparkled with excitement. "Do you think anyone suspects anything?" Ethan asked playfully, licking his cone. "Honestly, I don't know," Claire replied, a mischievous grin on her lips. "But I hope not." "Me too," he said, leaning in closer. "I don't want to hide what we have." "Neither do I," Claire agreed, her voice softening. "But we have to be smart about it." "Agreed," he said, feeling a rush of affection for her. "I just want to be close to you however we can." Their eyes met, and Ethan felt the air between them shift again. It was a familiar tension, the kind that promised more than just sweet treats and friendly outings. As they finished their ice cream, the playful banter continued, but the touches became more lingering, their hands brushing against each other in a way that sent shivers down his spine. Each accidental touch felt electric, igniting a fire within him that was impossible to ignore. After finishing their treats, they walked back to the car, their fingers intertwined. Ethan couldn't help but steal glances at Cla, her beauty captivating him. As they approached the vehicle, he could feel the butterflies in his stomach intensifying. "Can I kiss you again?" Ethan asked, as the softness of the night air to frame his request. He hoped for her response, both anxious and excited at the prospect. Cla looked at him, her cheeks tinged with pink. "I'd like That she whispered, her breath catching slightly with that simple affirmation. Ethan leaned in, closing the gap between them. Their lips met softly at first, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened into something more passionate. Ethan's heart raced as he felt her warmth against him, the kiss igniting every nerve in his body. He held her close, feeling the softness of her curves meld against him as they pulled away. Breathless and exhilarated, Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. This feels so right, he murmured, gazing into Cla's eyes, which sparkled with a mix of mischief and affection. It does, she agreed, her fingers still intertwined with his, but it's also a little scary in a good way, right? He asked, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. Definitely, Claire replied, her smile widening. I've never felt like this before. Ethan's heart swelled at her words. Me neither. I can't remember the last time I felt so alive. They shared a moment of silence, simply enjoying the connection they had forged. The world around them faded into the background, leaving just the two of them, suspended in a bubble of intimacy. Maybe we should go back to the car, Cla suggested softly, glancing toward the parking lot. It's getting late. Yeah, Leighton. Go, Ethan replied reluctantly, releasing her hand but feeling a newfound urgency to keep their connection alive. Once inside the car, the atmosphere shifted again, the tension crackling in the small space. Ethan turned the engine over, the sound echoing in the quiet night, but his focus was entirely on Cla. Her presence was intoxicating, and he found himself stealing glances at her as they drove through the dimly lit streets. Where to? Claire asked, breaking the silence. Just drive around a bit. I want to enjoy this moment with you, Ethan replied, his heart racing at the thought of being alone with her as they meandered through the quiet neighborhoods. Ethan couldn't help but reach for her hand again, interlacing their fingers. Cla looked at him, her eyes bright with delight, and he felt a rush of warmth flood through him. I really enjoy spending time with you, Ethan confessed, his voice soft. It feels special. It is special, Cla replied, her smile like lighting up the dimness of the car. I never expected to feel this way, especially not with you. Neither did I, he admitted, glancing at her as he navigated the streets. But I can't help how I feel. They drove for a while longer, the conversation flowing easily between them, sharing stories and laughter that felt both new and familiar. As they approached a secluded park, Ethan's heart raced with a sudden impulse. Leighton, stop here, he said, pulling into the empty parking lot beneath the trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting a soft glow around them. Okay, Cla said, intrigued. Once parked, Ethan turned to her, the weight of the moment settling between them. Can I kiss you again, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cla's eyes sparkled in the moonlight, and she nodded, leaning in closer. Their lips met once more, and this time it felt more urgent, more desperate. Ethan's hands found their way to Cla's waist, pulling her closer, their bodies fitting together perfectly. She responded eagerly, her hands tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened. The outside world faded away, leaving only the warmth of their bodies and the electricity of their connection. You feel amazing, Ethan murmured between kisses, feeling her heartbeat echo in the silence of the car. Maybe we should go somewhere a little more private, Cla suggested breathlessly, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Ethan grinned, feeling bold. There's a trail behind the park. It's secluded. No one should be around. Claire's gaze turned playful, lead the way with excitement bubbling inside him. Ethan exited the car, holding the door open for Cla. Together they walked Hand through the park, the moonlight illuminating their path. They ventured down the trail, the sounds of the night enveloping them, creating an intimate atmosphere. When they reached a small clearing, Ethan turned to CLA, his heart pounding in his chest. The quietness of the area felt magic, and he could sense the anticipation between them. "Wow," CLA whispered, taking in the beauty of the moonlit night. "It's perfect." Ethan agreed, stepping closer to her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. Their lips met once again, and this kiss was different, filled with a hunger that had been building since their first connection. Ethan felt the heat radiating between them, and he deepened the kiss, his hands exploring the small of her back, pulling her even closer. CLA responded with a soft moan, and he felt her body arch against his. Their kisses grew more passionate, and Ethan's heart raced with excitement and desire. Every brush of their lips ignited a fire within him, a need to be closer, to feel her warmth against him. As they kissed, Ethan could feel the world outside fading away, leaving just the two of them, lost in their own moment. The connection they shared felt deeper than anything he had ever experienced, and he craved every second of it. "Ethan," CLA whispered, pulling back slightly to catch her breath, "we shouldn't be doing this. It's complicated, I know," he replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "But I can't help it, I want you." CLA's eyes searched his, and he could see the mix of excitement and fear. "What if someone finds out? Then we deal with it together," he said, confidence swelling within him. "I don't care what people think, I just want to be with you." Her expression softened and she smiled. "You're right, I want to be with you too." With that affirmation they fell into another kiss, the world around them fading completely. The urgency of their connection propelled them forward, and Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. They were crossing boundaries, but it felt so right as they kissed. He felt CLA's hands slide down his arms, her fingers intertwining with his as they pulled away. "Leighton, take this slow," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "I don't want to rush things," agreed Ethan replied, his heart swelling with affection. "I want this to be special." They stood together, wrapped in each other's warmth, the moonlight casting a glow around them. Ethan knew they had entered uncharted territory, but the thrill of it only fueled his desire. "Can we just hold each other for a bit?" CLA suggested, her eyes sparkling. "Absolutely," he replied, wrapping his arms around her. They stood close, sharing quiet moments and whispers beneath the stars, the world around them fading away as the night deepened. Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had never felt so connected to someone, and he cherished every moment spent with CLA in that serene clearing, surrounded by the quiet of the night. They found comfort in each other's arms, holding on to the promise of what could be. The kiss they shared under the stars was just the beginning, and as they stood together, Ethan knew their journey was only starting. They would navigate the complexity of their relationship, but for now all that mattered was the warmth of their connection and the magic of the night. In the end, it was more than just a night at the movies or a stolen kiss in the park. It was the start of a beautiful, complicated romance that would change everything for both of them.